It's really great to have this opportunity. I was so pleased when Ken got in touch because in terms of Baptist, my heart has been with the Alliance since the formation, of course. And as Kevin can tell you, I live in Oregon, so there aren't really any Alliance congregations out this way. And so I'll talk a little bit about ending up in the UCC, but I always tell people I'm a Baptist in exile in the UCC. So y'all are my people, so it's really good to be here, and I appreciate that. Just to give you a little overview about how I'm going to go about this today and kind of where we're going to go and how we're going to end up. I'm going to start off with some practical matters for doing anti-racist work. Malou shared with me some of the questions some of you had sent in, and I know that people are always concerned about, you know, how do I do this work? How do I do this work in churches? And I'm going to give some practical stuff that'll also help us as we move toward the October session, which will be more participatory. And so we'll have some breakout groups and have some conversations among everyone then. And so I think these will be useful practical tools for that as well. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my story as sort of an example of how you can think about stories of race and racism, and then talk a little bit about stories in general and your story. And then, I mean, I'm an academic, so we have to talk some theory, of course, but hopefully I won't bore you with it. I think it's really interesting stuff. And then we'll finally end up asking, what does all this have to do with biblical stories? Now, I have no idea how long all of this is, so we will get as far as we get, and whatever we don't get to, we'll get to next month. And if we get through with all of it and still have time left, I'll do what I do in my classes and say, talk amongst yourselves, and we'll have some more conversation. But I think I probably have more material than we'll get to, but we'll just see what happens. So I'm going to jump in and go to some PowerPoints, and I've tried to not do what I normally do and put so much text on these that you can't see them if you're looking at them on a small screen. Though some of them, I apologize, do have too much text, but it just happened that way. And I did bring a cold back with me from London. It's not COVID, and I'm grateful for that, but my voice is not at its best, so I apologize for that in advance. And do feel free to use the chat function if you have comments or questions as we go along. So let me get going here with the PowerPoints. There we go. So one of the things that's really important in this work of anti-racism is that we are able to talk across our differences. And I know that just scares the dickens out of everybody because we're all afraid that we might say the wrong thing. And so I have for you here just some tips for talking across differences. And here's a list of do's, and I'll just highlight a few of these. And the first one is, do talk about differences. We can't do this work if we're sort of tiptoeing around the issues. And so we've got to talk about our differences and learn to be comfortable doing that. It's important that we watch our language, that we use the right terms, and often that's a matter of asking people what terms they think we should use, and it may vary depending on people and on the group. And it's really important to recognize that all of these things happen within context that are bigger than individual people. And so we always have to pay attention to experience, to history, to culture, and to context. And as we do that, it's really important that we assume the best of each other and that we give people a chance to grow and learn even as they make mistakes, because doing this work, we will make mistakes because we've learned a lot of misinformation. I mean, it's the air we breathe. And so we have to work that out. And so we have to be patient with one another, make some room for each other to make mistakes. There are also a few don'ts, and I'll make these PowerPoints available so that Malou can share those with folks. But it's really important to go into this work recognizing that people are experts on their own experience. And so we can't tell people what their experience is or how to interpret it. And so we don't want to go in this assuming we just see people, pretending as if the differences don't matter. It's also really important that we not play the oppression Olympics. And that's the ways that we often will try to say, my oppression's worse than your oppression. And we rank them. And there's a great essay by Audre Lorde. If you haven't read Audre Lorde, you need to read her before you do this work. You need to read the book Sister Outsider. I'm sorry. Because one of the things she talks about that's really important in this work too is that we don't forget the intersections. So race never exists apart from gender, apart from sexual identity, social class, and so on. And so we always have to recognize that those things are shaping one another, and so that our experiences will diverge based along those differences. And so the experiences, for example, of Black women and Latinas will be different based on differences of ethnicity and history and cultural context. And so we have to make room for that. And always take note that these can be very emotional conversations, and make space for that emotion and for the processing of it. And I think for the work we do in the church, that's really important to do, because it's going to bring up stuff. And a lot of times the stuff it brings up is because people think that when we begin to talk about this, that we're calling them racist. But see, the problem with that sort of thinking is it recenters the individual people instead of addressing the actual problem of racism. And so racism is not a problem of individuals, it's a problem of systems in which all individuals exist. And so while individual people can act in racist ways and have racist attitudes and do horrible racist things, the problem is really the system that ranks us so that we have greater social, political, economic power based on where we fall in those rankings around race, gender, class, and so on. And so it's really important to keep all that in mind. So it's a lot to juggle. I think Malou said that this is difficult work. And so it's important to keep that in mind as we engage in this. So obviously, those of you who are white and are here, you want to be allies to people of color. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. My guess is the men here want to be allies to women. The straight and cis folk want to be allies to queer folk. And so I think it's important that we start off and we think about, what does it mean to be an ally? Because this is a word that gets tossed around a lot, and people often think it's about just having good feelings toward other groups, but it's a lot more complicated than that. So the first thing we have to do is to start off with appropriate assumptions. And that means we have to get rid of our stereotypes. We have to make room for differences in individual experiences. We have to teach ourselves about others. We can't expect target groups to educate us. We have to educate ourselves. And we can't expect gratitude from the target group. So we don't go into this wanting, people of color to go, oh, what good white people they are. Oh, thank you so much for showing up for us. That's not the point of this. We do this work because it's the right thing to do. It's the work of justice. And so we don't go in expecting gratitude, and we don't get our feelings hurt if we don't get it. We do it because it's the right thing to do. To be an ally means to be an ally 100%, no strings attached. So we don't get to say, oh, she hurt my feelings, so I'm not going back. Oh, I didn't like the turn that took because they ignored my expertise. We have to do this work, and we can't make it tentative based on how we feel in the moment about something that happened. We have to get good information to replace all the misinformation we've been given all our lives. I mean, for white folks, and you know what it is, we know what we've been taught about whiteness, even though that was usually more covert, and what we've been taught about BIPOC, which was probably pretty overt for some of us, like myself, and maybe a little more covert for others. And so we have to educate ourselves and get that good information about what are the experiences of people who are different from ourselves. We have to pay attention to where our own issues and difficulties lie, because your buttons will get pushed in this work. And if you aren't aware and those buttons get pushed, then you may want to have the strings attached. You may want to stop out doing the work because somebody hurt your feelings. And so you really need to do your own work as you're doing this. You have to reject the entire mythical norm, not the parts that affect you. So the mythical norm is a concept we use to describe how people are closer to real social and political power based on their identities. So white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, well-to-do, educated, in this country, Christian. Anyway, the list kind of goes on, but that sort of, as we move up the scale, who those folks would be. And so it's not enough for me simply to reject patriarchy, nice as that is, But I can't then allow myself to benefit from white supremacy and pretend I'm not privileged in that way. So I have to reject all of it and work against all of it. We mentioned this before, but I'll come back to it because it's so important. Don't compare or rank oppressions. All oppression is evil. All oppression needs to be ended. And the only way we do it is all of us working together all at the same time. And so we have to do that complicated work of intersectionality. Don't be a one-issue person. Now, we don't have all the time in the world, and so sometimes we have to choose where we're going to put our energy. But you have to remember, again, because of those intersections, that we really are fighting all the oppressions all at once, all the time. And so sometimes we may highlight one aspect of it as we're doing and talking about anti-racist work. But when it's done right, anti-racist work is also anti-sexist work. It's also anti-heterosexist work, because we're fighting for all of these things to be ended so that we can create a just society for everybody. And then we have to interrupt oppressive behavior. And this is a hard one. God, I was raised to be a good Southern girl. I don't like conflict. I'm conflict avoidant. But to be an ally, we have to interrupt oppressive behavior. And so those are behaviors we have to learn. And they're things that we can do to teach ourselves how to do this. It doesn't mean we necessarily have to get in a fight with everybody that we see, but there are ways that we can do this so that we stop bad behavior in its tracks. And then make an ongoing commitment. Again, this is a life commitment. This isn't sort of some fad that we choose to do for a little while, but anti-racism has to be about who we are and a lifetime of work to make social change. So what are some things that allies need to remember? Being an ally is about listening. Too often, and especially I think white people are really bad about this, because white people are used to having an audience, and I hate to say, but white men are even more used to it than white women. The white women can do their share of talking over people, I know. But often we will go into these spaces and act as if we are the experts and we want to lead everything and we want to tell people what to do. And instead, we need to, in solidarity, go in and listen to people, because people are experts on their own experience. People in oppressed communities know what they need. They don't need us to tell them that. And so we really have to learn, when we go into a community that's different from our own, that we have to listen to start with. And then we have to stop thinking that ally is a noun and think about it as a verb, that it's something we do, not something that we are, that it's about the actions we engage in order to make a difference. And it's also not a self-proclaimed identity. So I don't get to say, ooh, I'm an ally to BIPOC. That's not my place to say. If I'm doing the work and BIPOC want to tell me I'm an ally, then I would take that with great honor, but it's not my place to say it. I just have to do the work. And allies don't get to take breaks. I don't get to get up in the morning and decide, oh, this anti-racist work is just too much for me. I need to take a break, because people of color don't get to take a break from anti-racist work. And so as an ally, I have to stay that engaged with it. Allies educate themselves constantly. As I said, we've got to do our own work and not ask oppressed communities to do that work for us. You can't be an ally in isolation either. You have to be in community with the people you're working with and support one another, because this work's exhausting. And you can see already there are hard truths to doing this work, and it ain't for everybody, because it is a real commitment. And so we need that support and that community in order to be effective. Allies don't need to be in the spotlight either. Again, it's not showing up in order to be in front and in charge. And I'll give you a quick story, mostly because it irritated me about 20 years ago, and it still irritates me every time I tell it. But many of you probably know about Take Back the Night marches. And these were marches that were started by feminists in some of the early anti-violence movement as a way to reclaim women's right to be in public space at night. And the idea was that women would go out and they would march together, essentially to say, it's my right to be here. Well, men got their feelings hurt because they weren't allowed to march. And then a lot of women who didn't like for men to get their feelings hurt said, oh, but you're a good guy, why don't you come march with us? And the year I'd had enough was when a well-meaning and wonderful white man led the march beating on a drum. And that's when I had it, because what that did again is it diminished any sense of women being able to be in public space at night by themselves without a male escort and feel safe. And it put a white man in the spotlight for this issue that had a long history of highlighting a problem specific to women. And then allies focus on those who share their identity. And what this means is white people got to do the work with white people. That's why I do this work, because I can say things to white people, for one thing, that might be dangerous for people of color to say. And I can get away with it because I'm white. I can get a different hearing because I'm white. And so it's my place to work with white people to dismantle white supremacy. And so it's not my place to, again, tell BIPOC how to do it, but it's my place to work with my people to tell them what we need to do and to make the case for anti-racism. When we make a mistake and we get told about it, we can't get defensive. And as I tell my students, it's not enough to say, well, I didn't intend any harm. Intentions are actually not all that relevant when you've done harm. I mean, the harm exists. And what you have to say is, I'm sorry. What can I learn? How can I do better? How do I make this right? And so allies really have to do that work of listening, apologizing, being accountable, and making change. And then allies never monopolize the emotional energy. And that's again about allies centering themselves about, oh, this is so painful for me as a white person to talk about all this and oh, the horrible things, my white people have done. And again, it refocuses, because we are used to being on center. When you're in a dominant group, part of what you get from that dominance is you get to be on center to the point you don't even have to recognize you're on center because you just think that's how the world works. And so we really have to work on raising our consciousness so that we are aware of the ways that we are on center, assume ourselves there, and then put ourselves there, even in the work that is well intended, like social justice work. So how do you do this work when it's likely that white people will be resistant to it? And I know this is a question a lot of people sent into Malou earlier. And so this is just some advice that comes from my years of this work. And I'll just go ahead, since we've got some sociologists there, and say, I have not done a study. So this is not necessarily valid, but it comes from my experience. So with those limitations, first of all, remember this is hard work and don't expect it to be otherwise. It's not easy, and that's okay. Hard work's not a bad thing. Have the courage of your convictions. And this is a tough one because you got to be willing to leave a job over this stuff if that's what it takes to do it. I mean, I look back at our history as Baptist and I see a moment when some people stopped telling the truth in the pulpit because it was too hard to talk about historical criticism. It was too hard to tell people, no, the Bible is not to be read literally, because they might get fired. And we see the consequences of allowing that. And I feel really passionately about this. If you are going to do the work of social justice, you've got to be willing to live with the convictions that you have and the consequences of that. Now, that doesn't mean be like stupid and go out of your way, like to get fired or something, but it means to recognize that while you can be, wise as serpents and harmless as doves about it, you still got to take some risk with this work. You got to get comfortable being uncomfortable, because it is uncomfortable work, because you're talking about things that, maybe you don't want to. And even when you're in the target group, again, if we're paying attention to those intersections, we all have that work to do. And so we're all going to be uncomfortable if we're doing this work. And that's okay, because then we're learning from each other and we're teaching ourselves how to be better advocates for social justice. And so we have to keep doing our own work. That means taking care of ourselves, not expecting other people, particularly people in the target group, to take care of us. It means educating ourselves. It means doing whatever we need to do to be our best at this work. We have to start with learners where they are. And this kind of goes back to courage of your convictions. You kind of have to keep these alongside each other, because it also doesn't do a lot of good to go and jump in to the most extreme versions possible of this work with people who've never even thought about the fact that they might have some privilege based on things like skin color or gender or sexuality. And so you've got to start with them where they are and then help them move along. And start with stories, because you can't really argue with a story. But it sits there and it grows and it challenges people, but in ways that are not nearly as threatening as propositions. And we'll come back to this in a minute. Remind people, as we talked about earlier, that you're not targeting them as individuals, but that you're really helping them think about a system of oppression that cost everybody something. Systems of oppression are bad for everybody. Now, it's different depending on where you're located in the system. But even if you're at the very top, it costs something of your humanity to keep other people down. So we're really all better off if we dismantle these systems of oppression. And so that's really the focus of our work, is how do we think about this structurally? How do we think about those big changes that'll make a difference? Don't leave out the intersections. You'll hear me continue to come back to this one because that's so important. Teach people how to read the Bible. And this goes back to having the courage of your convictions, because there's some stuff in there that people are not going to want to hear. And yet I think it has so much to teach us about race when we read it as we know we're supposed to read the Bible. I mean, we have all kinds of scholarship out there that can help us do this. And we have scholarship that will challenge us. And I hope I'm going to bring some of that when I get to the Bible, to think about it in different ways. I mean, I remember the first time I read post-colonial feminist biblical scholarship. Blew my mind. It still blows my mind because it's so far out of the ways that I was ever taught to think about it, and that my privilege allows me not to think about. And so I think we have to teach people how to do that and teach them to be excited about doing that and learning these new things and disrupting old ways of thinking. And I owe this to John Hendricks, who was my mentor in my doctoral work. Remember, nothing never happens. So whatever you do with all of this, something's going to happen that can become the basis for learning. Even if it blows up in your face, people can still learn from that. And then finally, another one I learned from John Hendricks: trust the process. It may be a long time before you see any evidence of any success of some of this stuff, but the process works. And there are other people who are going to be engaged, and people are going to have a lot of experiences over a lifetime. And I know anybody who is a teacher can tell you, there are kids that sit in your classroom. I'm not looking at you, Kevin, here now, but there are students who sit in your classroom and you think, oh, Lordy, nothing's getting through. And then who knows, 10 years down the road, you get a note that says, hey, do you remember me? Do you remember when you said this? And I said this back. Well, you were right. And the process works when you engage it in these ways that touch people's hearts as well as their heads, and give them new ways to think about issues and new ways to engage in the world. And then I love this from Loretta Ross, is that when we engage in this work, we really need to be about calling in instead of calling out. She says that calling out is a way that we publicly shame people for the mistakes that they made. So someone says something in a group that's really racist, and so we can pounce and call them out and make them feel terrible. And she says, when we do that work with people who've come together to do anti-racist work, she says it's kind of like we're in a circular firing squad. And she says that doesn't do anybody any good. She says instead we should be calling people in, which she says means that we seek accountability from other people with love and respect, instead of out of anger and punishment. And I think that's such a brilliant way to think about this work, because then it makes it less scary for us to imagine having those sort of hard conversations that are required to do this work. So how did I get here? What's my story with all of this stuff? So let me tell you a little bit about myself. So I was born in Rome, Georgia in 1960 to a Southern Baptist family. First place I ever went after the hospital was to a Southern Baptist church. Rome, Georgia, surprisingly, by 1960 was actually desegregated. I asked my mother about this once, and she said that the schools desegregated in 1957, right after she had graduated. And there weren't a lot of riots or the sort of big public difficulties. But the truth was that, as a matter of fact, we still lived pretty segregated lives. And so I grew up in the belly of white supremacy. And I grew up in a family that embraced very overt racism. I learned all the ugly words and all the stereotypes and all of the things that you can imagine someone would learn in Georgia in 1960. And then I would go to church and we would sing red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. And it seemed that nobody ever saw a problem with these two things, which, now I look back and it's a little baffling to me, but at the time we really didn't think that much about it. And so while we sang that at church, everywhere else and in church, I learned other messages about who people were based on the color of their skin. This is a picture of my paternal grandfather and grandmother and my cousins on their side of the family. And I didn't know it until 1974 when he died, but my grandfather was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. And I learned that because my father and his two siblings got into some arguments about who was going to get the Klan memorabilia. And so my father got the sash and the membership card, which he promptly put in a display case that was in our living room the entire time I was growing up. And so when I say I come at this stuff from the heart of white supremacy, I kid you not. So even though I didn't know my grandfather was in the Klan, I was also not terribly surprised to learn that about him. The message of hope, though, is that in 2 generations, we purged that crap out of the family, because my sister is also very engaged in anti-racist work. The cousins, not so much, but that's another story for another time. And then there was high school. So when I was in high school, and I want to say it was probably maybe 9th or 10th grade, I had what I can only describe as a Saul on the road to Damascus experience. And I remember it so clearly. It was the day I told the last racist joke I would ever tell. And it was still kind of hanging in the air like in a little thought bubble when I was struck with conviction that this is wrong and don't you ever do it again. And that became the moment where that 180-degree turn happened. And I realized I had to change my ways. And then I started that journey. And of course, it would be a journey, as you can imagine. I mean, in high school, it's 74, 75, and I'm just realizing that I need to do something different. And so I made that commitment, and that one has stuck. And then I went to college and then off to Southern Seminary. And I went there in the midst of controversy. I got to Southern in 1982, just in time to hear Roy Honeycutt give his famous Camelot sermon in the chapel where he said, this is coming, watch out for it. And Southern at the time was still a place, though, where we did critical thinking. They still had a lot of work to do on gender and race, but it was a place where there was a lot of student interest and activism around racial justice, around poverty, gender by the women in ministry, but that's another story as well. And so Southern was a place where I really started to think about these things and began to recognize that these issues of race had to be central to my faith. And so I came to the conclusion that I couldn't go to an all-white church anymore because I thought, I'm not sure how this can be church. And I thought, if we can't get it together here of all places, what hope is there? Now, you try finding a multiracial church, and it is not easy. And I was fortunate enough that a church had formed called Shalom Baptist Church in inner city Louisville. And Wes and Jane Lights were the co-pastors, and it was a small church. It was biracial. It had formed with racial justice as its core commitment. And so for my last 2-3 years at Southern, I joined Shalom Baptist Church. And that was actually the church that ended up ordaining me a few years later. So, excuse me. From there, I went to California Baptist College, where I taught for a few years, and then to George Fox College in Oregon. And what I realized was that often conservative Christian liberal arts colleges are not ready for a young feminist teaching religion. And so I realized that I had to make some changes in my life. And so I did what I do when I have a life crisis. I went back to school. And so I went down to Oregon State and got a degree in women's studies and English. Women's studies is what it was called at the time. And when I left George Fox, I got a call from the director of women's studies at Oregon State, who asked if I would ever want to teach there. And that had really become my dream job. And so I said, yes, please. And so came to OSU in 1996. So about the same time, I had also realized that I couldn't be Southern Baptist anymore, because I'd sort of hung on. I went to the one moderate Southern Baptist church in Oregon that was up in Beaverton. But then you may remember that the convention changed its constitution to exclude any church that implied acceptance of homosexuality. And that was it for me, less because of my own identity and more because the Baptist in me just couldn't take it, that, they had made a theological belief core to our Constitution, and this is the one they had picked. And so I left and started a process of looking for somewhere else to go to church. And that was horrible out here, because churches were either way too conservative or way too white. It's Oregon, which we have our own horrible history of race and racism, and Kevin well knows out here. And I was really struggling with trying to find somewhere to go to church. And so I got up one Sunday and I said, all right, this is it. Either I find a church today or I'm joining the Unitarians, because they had this amazing pastor at the Unitarian Church of Portland. And I thought I would be perfectly happy there. And so I went to the Yellow Pages and I opened it up, and I had been to all kinds of UCCs in Portland, because I thought, well, in terms of theology and polity, they're the closest, because I just couldn't be a Methodist or an Episcopalian or Presbyterian, because I couldn't live with the polity. And so I thought, well, okay, the UCC. And I found an ad, tiny little ad for Ainsworth United Church of Christ. And the ad said, a multiracial, multicultural congregation. And I thought, yeah, right. I know what that means. One Black family and a Latino janitor. I know what that means. And I went, and much to my surprise, the church is up in North Portland. I pulled up and got out of the car, and I was the only white person I saw for a while. And I got in, and at that point, the church was about a third Black, a third white, and a third everybody else. And we're talking, 100, 120 people in worship. It wasn't a big church. And that morning I got there and I sat down, and in comes the choir from the back, led by a Black woman singing "Woke Up This Morning with My Mind Stayed on Jesus." And this choir comes in and they're doing this music out of the civil rights movement. And they're in between pastors. And so this old Japanese American man gets up to preach, and he preaches on gay rights. And I thought, this is it. I'm home. I have found my place. And so in 1996, I joined Ainsworth United Church of Christ, which is still a multiracial, multicultural church. And as you can see, they've added a lot of other things since then, becoming open and affirming, which is the UCC's way of saying we support queer folk. It's a just peace church, accessible, new sanctuary, the whole bit. And my pastor will be the first to tell you I don't go as often as I could because it's a 3-hour round trip from Corvallis up there. But it's a place where I see what can be, where people have made a commitment to this. And even now we're having conversations because that community has gentrified. And so the church is whitening. And so we're having these conversations about what does this mean and what are we going to do about it? Because this is core to our identity. And so we're kind of figuring that out. And they reminded me that this dream of racial solidarity in the church is possible, but it takes a lot of work. And I tell you what, you can go to this church and you will know the first service whether or not it's somewhere you think you can belong, because they speak their truths and they center these issues of justice. And I know that's not for everybody. A lot of people don't want to be reminded of those things when they go to church. They just want to, sing happy songs and go home and feel better. And that's not what we get there. I mean, I feel better. I feel a lot better because they are speaking the language of justice every Sunday. And so we can do it. And so I say that as a word of encouragement to you about this work too, is I think this is the kind of stuff exactly that Alliance churches are situated better than most denominations I know to do. And so I really think that this is work that can be done. This also started to have some impact on me career-wise. I mean, I had always centered this stuff in my teaching, and I really started to center it in my writing. And then the serendipitous moment came when my colleague, Robert Thompson, there saw I was using one of Grace Kim's books in one of my classes. And Robert's like, oh, I've met Grace before. Why don't we invite her to speak at OSU? And I was like, this is Grace. Great. And so Grace came and we just hit it off. And we started talking about what can we do together? What can we do together? And what we came up with is a book that's called Intersectional Theology. It was published by Fortress Press. And what we did is we took the questions of intersectionality that come out of women and gender studies, and we applied them to theology and developed a theological method, essentially. And the book is written for a broad audience, so it's not a dense academic theological tome. But centered in that scholarship is this sort of commitment to doing this work at every level. So both in my personal and in my professional life. And then since then, I've really spent my career working on these justice issues. I mean, that's kind of what I do at OSU and everything in my teaching, my scholarship, and in my service. And this work, as I've mentioned before, isn't simply individual work, but it's structural work. And so I have tried to work with groups and to create structures that reflect this. And so you see here, for example, this picture of me and my colleagues in women and gender studies, and I hired all of these people. And I very purposefully worked through our system and pushed at its boundaries when I could to ensure that I could hire a diverse group of people. And there are ways to do this and stay within laws and you do it the right way. But some changes have to be made to everyday business about hiring to do that sort of thing. Another picture here is the team from a National Science Foundation advance grant that we had to do institutional transformation, particularly around STEM at OSU. And one of the commitments we made in this project team was that at every level, every group would reflect our commitments to diversity. And so we made sure that every group had people who represented BIPOC, queer, different disciplines. I mean, those sorts of differences you find in academia. And then Ken mentioned my experience of 10 years with Diversity Academy at Chico State, where we've worked really hard to do some institutional transformation there. And we've had this ongoing relationship for quite a while there. So what I hope you see in this is that in my telling of my story, I mean, I'm giving you information in one way, but I'm also creating meaning. I'm creating meaning for myself. I'm creating meaning for you. And you might, tell my story a little differently, those of you who've known me for a while and seen other pieces. But our stories let us construct meaning through the things that we tell, what we highlight, how we put it all together. And then these stories help us see things differently. And so when I sit down to tell my story about race and racism, I begin to see, for example, how white supremacy played a role and how at every point in that story, white privilege benefited me. And that this story would have been different if I were Black or brown. It'd be a different story if I were a man. It would be a different story if I were a white man or a man of color. And so this story really begins to help me see how those things came together in my life. Stories also help us enter the worlds of people who are different from ourselves. And so while I can't know what it is to be different from who I am, I can listen to other stories and develop empathy and begin to have some sense of what the world is like for other people. Stories are really useful for this work because they transcend statements of fact or propositions. And so they really help us think on a different level. And importantly, they allow us to hold multiple and often contradictory experiences in mind at the same time. And so whereas, when we're doing propositional theology, it tends to be very linear and it's right or it's wrong. And we see where that kind of thinking's gotten us, right? I mean, it's created deep, deep divisions and harm across the world. And stories let us hold all those things side by side, And so on the one hand, I can recognize that my grandfather was kind to me. My grandfather was in the Klan, and I have to let those things stand side by side. My other grandfather hit my grandmother, and he was kind to me. And we have to let those things be complicated. And that's part of what's so hard in all of this work, is we can't be reductionist. We can't reduce this to something simple. It's not simple. It's incredibly complicated. But that's also what's so wonderful about it, is that it's our complications that are interesting. If it were simple, we'd all be kind of boring, I think. So we create ourselves, we create meaning, and we create knowledge as we tell our stories. And so your stories have something to add to this larger conversation. And I think as you invite your churches to tell their stories, your people in your churches to tell their stories, you'll see that we keep adding to the space of knowledge, and it becomes more complicated, and we can invite more people into it. So, and this is one of those, I'm sorry, there's a lot of text here, but I needed all of this to be on the same slide, so forgive me. But I want to take a moment for you just to pause, and if you have a pen and paper, if you're old-fashioned like me and still like to do that, or if you want to type something on your computer or iPad. But I want you to think about your own story of learning race and racism for a minute. And I want you to think about it a little differently depending on whether you're white or you're BIPOC. And so I want you to think about, when did you first become aware of race? And as you saw in my story, I was aware of it pretty early on because that was a facet of our identities. We were white. When were you aware of racism? When you became aware that there was something not quite right with all of this. If you're white, what did your whiteness mean for you? How do you think your whiteness has advantaged you? How does your whiteness intersect with other forms of difference? When did you first understand racism as a problem? Have you ever confronted other white people about racism? And then think really, really deeply about this one. How does white supremacy structure your daily life? And then for BIPOC participants, same thing. When did you become aware of race and racism? What did your racial ethnic identity mean for you? How has the pervasive system of white supremacy affected you? How do your race and ethnicity intersect with other differences? Have you engaged in coalitional activism with white allies? And if so, how has that experience been? And then how does white supremacy structure your daily life? So let's just pause. I'm going to be quiet for a few minutes and just jot down a few notes thinking about your own story. So imagine you have to do what I just did. What stories would you tell? So take just a minute. So I'm going to mute myself till we're ready to come back.
As you're doing that, Susan, just know there was one question so far of someone said they need an example of how you call someone in. They need an example of that. So that's one question that's on the table. Okay.
Yeah, let me go ahead since we're there, and y'all can start thinking about what to. This is something that I have to do with my students all the time, because students can say things that just make your eyes bulge sometimes. And so one way I call them in is, let's say they say something really problematic, really racist or sexist or homophobic, whatever. Rather than focusing on them and saying something like, you are so wrong, you are so ignorant, you need to work on yourself, I put the comment on the table and let them sort of fade into the background so that they have room to change now. And so I'll say, okay, let's take this comment. Let's look at this. What does this mean? What are some other ideas? And by doing that, this person now has some room to save face, because if you attack somebody directly, they often will harden because they can't save face. But this way they save face, and that makes them more open, I think, to hearing what you have to say than if you were really calling them out and saying, I can't believe you said that. That's horrible. Don't ever say that. A specific example. Okay, so I don't know if this happens in the rest of the country. I don't know, Kevin, if this happens in your classes. Our students in Oregon will sometimes use colored as shorthand for people of color. Does that yeah, Kevin, you're looking shocked. Yeah, you can imagine my shock the first time it happened, but it happens a lot. So if that happens in class, instead of jumping all over them, I say, okay, let's talk about this term colored. Did y'all know that this has a racist history? Let me tell you about that. And that way, the person that used it can learn, not feel bad about themselves, and not feel targeted. So that would be one example of how you call someone in. Asking follow-up questions could be another one. Oh, well, what do you mean by that? Well, tell me more about that. Have you ever thought about this? And so it's just all those ways that you keep people accountable, so you never let it go unaddressed. That's kind of the worst thing you can do, is let it go unaddressed. But making space for people to learn from that moment. But you have to address it, because also you're responsible for ensuring that people who have been targeted by that know that you have also called for accountability for it. And so it's important for everybody in the room, when something happens, that you address those things. So I hope that helps. All right, so let me be quiet for a minute and give you a chance to think about your own stories. Normally I'd give us more time to do this, but I'm Malou, I am watching my watch here, so I'm aware of time. But again, I'll make these available through Malou, and I'd really like for you to, between now and October, really think about this stuff, because I think to do this work, it's really important to be aware of yourself and where you fit in all of this. Is there somebody who just really quick has like one thing you thought about that you'd like to unmute yourself and tell us? Anybody? Yeah, Amber. Oh, you're muted, Amber.
Okay. I was trying to figure out how to do it. I got my son in the background here, but recently I was talking with a Black mother about how her experiences shopping with her kids, and how she has to really police her children and make sure that they're always on their best behavior, that they don't have the same opportunity. Like, my kids are just pal around and scream, and usually people in the store will like, oh, they're so cute, do you want a cookie? And that's not the same experience that many Black mothers have. They have to very much keep everybody on a short leash per se, and just because of their experience being you know, out in the world.
Yep. Yeah, thank you, because that's a great contrast about how white supremacy structures lives differently. And so this Black mother has to think about things in a different way than a white mother would have to think about them. If you all haven't read Peggy McIntosh's article on unpacking the invisible knapsack, I would recommend that. Though sometimes people think that privilege is the problem. I would argue that privilege is the symptom. Again, the problem is racism. The problem is the system of oppression. Because of systems of oppression, then people have these privileges and disadvantages. And so that's worth a read, just to sort of think about all those things that are often invisible to us when we're in positions of dominance and don't have to think about those sorts of things. And then you can also think about those in terms of gender and sexuality and social class and on and on. So thank you for that. But keep thinking about these things, because I believe that these are important ways to imagine where your own story intersects with the rest of the stories of the people doing this work and with the biblical story. So just a quick little bit of theory, and I promise we're going to get to the Bible. It may be next week, but all this will be important to thinking about how we read the Bible, or next month, sorry. So when I talk about race, I'm not talking about a biological reality, but rather race is a social construct. So it's a group of people who perceive themselves and are perceived by others as possessing distinctive hereditary traits. And so race gets defined differently depending on whose power and who needs to define race in what ways. So in this country, for instance, once upon a time, Irish people and Jews and Italians weren't white. They became white through social processes. Ethnicity has to do with cultural traits such as language, religion, family customs, and food preferences. And so we see that when we talk about people who are Latinx. And so that's an ethnicity and not a race. Race is constructed in a number of ways. One is institutionally. And so this is the way that social institutions determine racial membership. The census, for example, is a way that race gets constructed institutionally, because the census gives you categories and you have to tick off a box. Race is also constructed interpersonally, and this is the ways that we need to define others by distinct racial categories. Now, this doesn't happen so much for white people, because people don't usually ask me, now, what are you? I mean, people read me as white, they know I'm white, but people who are people of color often will get asked that. Why do we need to know? Because that changes how we treat one another. And then there's the internal construction of race. And this is the way that we come to internalize our own understandings of our race and the values that are associated with being a member of that race. Racism, then, is a system of oppression. And this is really important because too many people talk about racism as individual attitudes and bad acts. And those are features of racism. But racism is that larger system that is created and maintained by social institutions and by language and by other symbols. And so if we want to be anti-racist, we have to tackle the system itself. So it's not enough simply to have goodwill toward everybody who's different from ourselves. That doesn't change the system that differently advantages people, because that's baked into education, into government, into economics, and into the church. Oh, here we go. The boogeyman of the right, critical race theory. I was shocked when this became a big to-do, because I've been doing critical race theory forever. It developed out of and in opposition to critical legal studies. And it was because if you look at the law, what you see is the law is predicated on experiences of white people. And so what critical race theory tries to do is recognize that racism is a facet of everyday life. And so critical race theory starts not with the experiences of the dominant racial group, but rather with the everyday experiences of BIPOC. And in order to do that, you have to address the power relations between white people and BIPOC. So again, it can't be simply attitudes and individuals, but it has to be the systems that give power and differently advantage some people over others. And so one of the key methods of critical race theory is counter storytelling. And so what critical race theorists will do is to put a story from a BIPOC person up against sort of the dominant narrative. And that then begins to expose the problems with the dominant narrative. And we begin to say the dominant narrative is not true for everybody. And so critical race theory recognizes that race isn't biological, but that racism is still real because race gets constructed to advantage some people over other people. So this is what's so scary, critical race theory. And what's scary in it is because it is recognizing that racism is baked into the fabric of society in such ways that every institution that we have, our language itself, is not simply a reflection, but actually perpetuates racism. And I believe Malou sent out to you the short piece by Nicholas Pert about why the police, why the NYPD after me. Did folks get a chance to read that? So in this, Nicholas Pert tells this story about growing up in New York and constantly being stopped by the police for doing nothing except being Black in public. And yet we know that for white folk, the dominant discourse of law enforcement is that it's fairness, it's crime and punishment. We're all equal under the law. And what we see here in these numbers that are there on the right side of the screen is that Black people and white people have really different perceptions about the police. And so critical race theory holds these two things up and says, okay, what's going on here? So we have this dominant narrative about fairness, and then we have poor Nicholas Pert over here who's getting stopped by the police simply for walking down the street doing nothing. And so how does his story challenge this notion of equality under the law? How does it expose the contradictions of that? And then how does it show the law as a social institution that actually ends up perpetuating racism? And then the other piece you have is a little piece I did with my colleague Regina McClinton on critical race theory and the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan is a counter story, right? So you had this lawyer who had this sort of dominant discourse that, you know, if I keep the law, I'm doing what I need to do. And, you know, Jesus essentially says, well, maybe not, you know, and then the lawyer keeps trying to justify himself, and he says, well, you know, who's my neighbor? Because in his mind, his neighbor were people just like him. And then Jesus tells this counter story that gets held up against this narrative of my neighbor is the person like me. And then Jesus tells this other story. So Samaritans were ethnically and religiously suspect. So Jesus's audience would not have expected a Samaritan to be the hero of the story. And this would have shocked Jesus's listeners. And what we recognize in this is that outsiders often may have a better understanding than insiders of what's going on because they're in a better position to see what's going on. W.B. Du Bois talked about this as a kind of a double vision that oppressed people have, because you have to know your own world, but you also have to know the world of the dominant forces to survive in it. And so what we see is that the insiders claim they're keeping the law, but in reality, they're violating the spirit of it. And so if we really start to think about who white people are in this story, we realize there aren't a lot of options, because we're either in the ditch and we need healing from our racism, or we're like the priest and the Levite who walk on by because we're too invested in our own racial and religious purity to help. And so this story, read as critical race theory, doesn't leave room for the good white people who think they aren't complicit with the system of racism. And so what it makes clear is that white people don't get to escape accountability for racism just because they announce their good intentions toward people of color. Ooh, this is not how we usually hear this story read, is it? No, we always want to be the good Samaritan, don't we? But we're not Samaritans if we're the white people, you know. We're kind of in the ditch, or we're passing folk on by. And so you start to see with this the power of bringing these new ideas into the ways that we can read the Bible through anti-racist lenses. Now, we'll pick up from here in October and start to think about some different methods of reading the Bible that really get to the heart of this. And so we'll move beyond simply historical critical readings of the text to really start thinking about what does it mean to read the Bible through a lens of anti-racism. And there are specific methods out there that'll be really helpful. And I'm going to have Malou send you some homework to do for the next time that'll let you practice some of these tools, and then we'll talk about them specifically. So I finished 2 minutes early according to my watch, which means we can have a little longer for comments and question and answer and whatever you all want to do with our last few moments.
Yeah, in terms of the chat, that's the only question that I saw in the chat. There were some folks kind of responding. Someone talked about how good your book is. Another person talked about how they also heard colored growing up and didn't know it was negative. Ken, he answered your question about his first racial experience, saying he heard his grandpa use the N-word and he knew it was wrong. So there's a couple of messages in there. Oh, here's a question. If there is one book you would have us read between now and October, what would it be?
Ooh.
I know, one book. My goodness.
That's hard. Sister Outsider, Audre Lorde. She changed my life. She changed the way I thought about this stuff.
Amen to that answer. Amen.
Yeah, and it was stuff that was written, gosh, in the 70s, 80s, and it's still so relevant in so many ways. And it won't be hard for you to make the leap from that to what we do in the church. So that's what I'd recommend. And it's a collection of essays. So, just treat it like your Bible read, and just read one a night and you'll get right through it.
So are there other folks so Ken raised his hand. Great. If there are other people who want to make a comment, you can look in the chat. You can write it in the chat and I'll say it, or just raise your hand and then you can talk. So Ken, go ahead.
Thank you, Susan, again. So much of your work tonight you presented is contingent on our capacity for telling our stories. I find in churches that that's not always the first proclivity of people, both first to be willing to share and second to dig into their own introspection. So I want to recommend, although it goes back a few years, your book on storytelling in religious education. It is a phenomenal book that transformed my ministry and transformed my congregation at the time. And I've really depended on that, and even try in worship services to have faith stories shared. Amber, who you heard from earlier, is in our congregation, and she's really good about telling stories and sharing and using introspection to develop these stories. So folks, if you haven't read Susan's book, Storytelling in Religious Education, it will go a long way for you.
Well, thank you for that. And it is an older book, though. I would say I'd still stand by the idea. Some of the language is probably outdated. I probably don't, use queer quite as much, or certainly not BIPOC, because we didn't have that language back then. So if you do read it, be aware of that. But it was interesting because I started that book when I was teaching religion, and I finished it after I switched to what was women's studies at the time. And that transformed the book. And so it really became a book about storytelling as a form of social justice in the church. So thank you for that, Ken.
Could you give us the name of the author, Sister Outsider?
Oh yeah, Audre Lorde, and it's Audrelorde. Audre Lorde.
Thank you.
We have one question.
Okay.
Years ago, books used to advocate calling out white people for racist actions when in the company of BIPOC. So as to stand with them, BIPOC, I'm assuming. Also, just notice for y'all that when we say BIPOC, we're also leaving out Asians and Latinx people. But is there a time to call out racist behavior, or does calling in people, or is calling in people the more productive for moving people and helping them become self-aware? So is that the best response in the long run?
That's certainly what Loretta Ross advocates. And Loretta is a longtime anti-racist activist and who started and really has done most of her work in reproductive justice for women of color. And yeah, she says that it's counterproductive to shame people, that doesn't give people room to change. And so calling in is no less taking a stand, standing alongside, marking that a wrong has been done. It's just a way to do it that invites somebody back in instead of pushing them further out. And so it's not being like all, sort of wimpy and namby-pamby about it, but it's really about thinking strategically and effectively about this. I mean, sometimes, we get our ire up and we just want to like light into somebody. But I think if we let our better selves say to us, do I want to feel justified or do I want to be effective? And I think being effective is better work for God's community.
Will this, oh, that was just to me. Never mind. Are there any other questions? We have room for like maybe one more question or comment.
Well, I do have to say our next session in October is going to be much more interactive. So y'all have heard more of me than you probably ever wanted to hear. But next time, we're going to have you working in some groups. We're going to have some activities to do that'll help you dig into the Bible and really think about some of the biblical stories differently. Because this is some work I've done with some amazing biblical scholars that just blows my mind every time I come back to it. It's great stuff. And so I think you'll really enjoy that. So I promise you won't have to listen to me nearly so much next time.
Oh, no. We need to hear your voice. What you had to say was amazing. So could you guys join me in taking a moment to thank, excuse me, allergies. Oh, one more question. Hold on. Is there a specific Bible you use? That's a good question. So we'll answer that and then I'll thank you.
Yep. I use the New Revised Standard Version.
New Revised Standard. Okay, cool. I have a copy of the Inclusive Bible here that I've been looking at. I haven't gotten into it real deep, but that's interesting. So, okay, now with that being said, if you all will take a moment, unmute yourselves as you're able. And if you can't unmute yourself, use your reactions. But let us give a round of applause to thank Susan for everything that she offered and for starting us so well on this journey.
Bravo.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Yes, even the dog know you did a good job. So we Susan will be with us next time. So I hold on. Let me get to everyone in the meeting. I am dropping a link in the chat. So for those of you who don't know what that means go to your chat and click on that link and it'll open it. And there's a form that I would like for you to complete. That form gives some assessment of what happened today. Also, Susan has another question for you guys. So there's a question from Susan. So please take the time to fill that form out. For those of you who may not be as computer savvy, in tomorrow sometime, I will send out another email that will have the Google form in it. But I just want to do both for those who feel tech savvy and for those who may need a little bit more help. We are super, super excited, like I said, that Susan is going to be here. We are going to have our second session on October. This is me talking slow so I don't say the wrong thing. On October 11th from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern. So I'm really hoping that you all will be there. Um, and just to put another plug in, just in case you haven't seen, we are going to be taking a trip in November, the Alliance. And so we have our meeting in Montgomery, Alabama. So if you are able to come, we would love to see you there as we continue to do this good work. So again, I just want to say thank you all for being here. Please take a moment to complete the form, and thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you in October.